They're competing with each other on they're competing with each other on the basis of imagination. They're competing with each other on the basis of the ability to create desires, on the ability to forge some kind of emotional link with consumers. And competition and price competition essentially disappears at that time. Okay, that's the second part. It's the second reason. The third aspect, the third major change I want to look at is, and we've looked at some of this already, this is called the social crisis of industrialization. That advertising actually, that the early years of industrialization, in fact, cause a major crisis. There is a major crisis. The author connected to this is an author called Stuart Ewan, who wrote, I mentioned before, he wrote one of the first books on it called Captains of Consciousness. And he argues that advertising, that the term social crisis of industrialization is Ewan's term. Okay, that's the term that he uses to describe it. So he's one of our best social historians, one of the first people to really take consumption seriously as an object of study for historians. Because actually consumption wasn't taken very seriously as an object of study by historians. And he argues that advertising arises as a response to what he calls the social crisis of industrialization. What is the social crisis? Well, on the one hand, okay, we're familiar with this. This is a crisis of consumption. People simply are not buying enough. Right? It's a crisis of underconsumption. We've looked at this already. Okay? Caused by too many objects caused by the production of the immense collection of things, immense collection of commodities. The people would have to be socialized into buying them. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because we've already dealt with that. But Ewan argues, so there's that one. That's a very serious crisis. You don't solve that. The society is dead. The economy is dead. If you don't solve that problem, but he says there's an equally urgent problem in the realm of production. Because industrialization, that is people working in factories, moving from the land, working in factories, was more than just producing goods in a new way. It involved, in fact, a whole new process of how goods were being produced. It involved the whole process of socialization into new ways of producing goods. And in fact, in the early years of industrialization, if you come from the rhythms of the land, that is what's important in terms of how you operate, how you work on a daily basis in terms of the sun going up and then the sun going down, and this is the rhythms of the season and the rhythms of, I don't want to over-romanticize it, this is the rural living is really tough living. I mean, people are on the edge of starvation a lot of the time. But the rhythms that determine the rural living are very different. They're the rhythms of nature. Well, in the factory, what you're governed by is not nature. You're governed by the time clock. You're governed by this clock that says your work starts now and it ends 14 hours later. In fact, there's a very interesting essay written by another social historian called E.P. Thompson about what the work clock means as a new mode of socialization. That you have to socialize people into a different way of thinking about themselves and what they do in terms of production. As I said, the time clock replaces nature. And in that sense, this is a fundamental shift in the way in which people lived and worked and thought about the world. This isn't just always a new way of doing it. It is a revolutionary way of doing it. And in fact, the early years of industrialization, the early years of capitalist industrialization, they're not some kind of smooth, functioning system, as some of the history books may tell us. In fact, what is central to this early factory production and to early factory experience is working class resistance to the factory. This is a time of intense conflict between workers and people who own factories, in which workers are trying to do as little as possible, and trying to have as much control of their lives, and capitalists are trying to get them to do as much as possible for the least amount of wages. And this is not some harmonious period of, well, I have this labor to sell and you have labor to buy, and this is a period of intense conflict. It's a period of intense class conflict. And Ewan argues And much of this resistance, Ewan argues, is not just about the way that people want more wages. Much of this resistance is about the nature of industrial capitalism itself. Is about the nature of factory work itself. It's about the nature of its dehumanizing qualities, the nature of its alienating qualities, where people become just a cog in the machine. Again, I was going to play a little clip from. If you want to, Charlie Chaplin actually did a really interesting. Charlie Chaplin, the great comedian, his great film was called Modern Times. And if you can look at it on YouTube. You can find it easily on YouTube, and we'll watch the clip. And it's about how, in fact, workers get integrated into the system of production as nothing more than machines. They become simply cogs in the machine, and they actually start to change their own nature as a result. So as a result, the early years of industrial capitalism are periods of intense working class resistance to the factory. And the way it's solved in the early 20th century, the way this is solved in one way is through force, in which capitalists use the police to break down unions, to break down working class resistance to this. So this is a period of intense class conflict. Now, a crisis in one of these areas, right? A crisis in consumption is enough to make sure the society is not going to survive. A crisis in production by itself will be an equally severe crisis. Capitalism at this point is faced with a crisis in both its major realms, both in how the immense collection of things are produced, and also in how you're going to sell the immense collection of things. How you're going to I mean, as I said, this is unless you can solve both of these problems, you can't just solve one. You have to solve both. And Ewan argues that advertising would solve both problems simultaneously. That was its genius. It would solve both problems by one. We've looked at this before. It would create desires in people to buy the immense collection of commodities. And secondly, it would redefine the identity of workers as consumers. That is, if advertising can, through its stories, be able to convince people that they should really think of themselves not as workers essentially, but as consumers, then work simply becomes a means to another end. And people won't struggle about it so much. Then it's just, well, you've got to put up with work to get what we need, which is money, so that we can really be consumers. This is, if you go back to the critics, of course, this is the last part of that argument, which is advertising as a form of social control, advertising as a form of ideology and social control. But again, at this point, it's absolutely fundamental. You've got to be able to you've got to be able to distract people from their role as producers and get them essentially to go along with whatever happens in the world of production, so that they can actualize themselves as consumers. If you can do that, if advertising could do that, you could solve both problems. You've solved the problem of consumption, and you've solved the problem of conflict in the world of production as well. You've solved the social crisis of industrialization. Let's go to quote number 4 as a summing up. This is from a book by William Lease and some others called Social Communication and Advertising. They say, quote 6, summing this up, a century ago in North America and Western Europe, the forms of privileged discourse that touched the lives of ordinary persons were church sermons, political oratory, and the words and precepts of family elders. Okay, that's the old time. Such influences remain with us, but their prominence within the affairs of everyday life and the rhetorical force and moral authority that they carry are sharply diminished. The space left as these influences have diminished has been filled largely by, you remember this phrase now, it's been filled largely by the discourse through and about objects. So those old institutions of meaning, of symbolism, family, community, religion, they've become much, much less important. And into that void, and as we move from one type of society to another, and into that void has come advertising. And so it's now the stories of advertising that now influence how we think about ourselves. Well, that movement is no accident. It is not individual creation, but it comes out of the movements of history. Okay, what we'll look at next time is how the industry arose as a response to this.